Hey everybody, and welcome back to JS101. This week we're going to be talking about, we're going to be starting Module 7, and we're really going to be talking about terrorism as a method of social control. So we're really not going to be focusing on terrorism as an action, as much as we're going to be focusing more on how the state defines terrorism and how that can be used to delegitimize um, different social movements. So we're not really going to be focusing on things like international terrorism. We're going to take much more of a domestic um, approach, although we will touch on international issues from time to time. But really, what this goal is the goal of this week, is to understand how social constructs and labels such as terrorism can be used as a way for the state to maintain hegemony. Like I said, for this entire class, hegemony is going to be a main thing that we're going through and we're going to keep talking about. So, um, also understand that as we're going through the definitions and critiquing them, that should not be seen as a way of um, condoning actions or saying, oh, it wasn't that bad. No, it's a way of if we're acting as social scientists, we need to be able to understand, critique, and take apart some of these social constructs and definitions, even while condemning them at the same time. So just bear that in mind. So, as always, give you a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be go over a couple of definitions of terrorism, including a couple that come from the reading this week from the Turk piece. Before we go into spend a couple minutes talking about political and just war definitions and how those can bring up critiques of some of the more traditional definitions of terrorism. Before we move into state terrorism, and then finally radical environmentalism. That may not seem like the most obvious way of examining terrorism, but anybody that remembers the late 90s, early 2000s, you'll remember that this was a big thing that the media and FBI were focusing on, were these radical environmental acts. And so that provides a really useful lens for us to go through and examine some of these definitions and whether or not certain actions that are labeled terrorism can actually reach that level of what we socially construe as terrorist actions. And that'll make more sense as we go along. So we really need to understand that terrorism is really inconsistently defined in both applied and scholarly circles. Every federal agency will have different definitions of terrorism. Every academic that will go through and study terrorism will have a slightly different definition of it, and all of these other things. And because that, we need to remember that terrorism is a social construct, as everything in our society is. It's made up. The definition of terrorism does not exist in nature. It is something that we as a society defined. And so we need to understand and examine how that definition can benefit certain people in power and harm others. So the state is going to interpret and label an event and its causes as terroristic, not necessarily in the interest of empirical accuracy or consistency, but in a conscious effort to manipulate perceptions to promote certain interests at the expense of others, is really what I'm saying. And the accusation of terrorism, even implicitly, is going to have multiple consequences. It's going to grant law enforcement a variety of new powers and fewer procedural limits protecting accused peoples. And this can result in an automatic presumption of guilt, indefinite detention if we're looking at things like Guantanamo Bay, lack of counsel, in some cases, the inability to receive a fair trial, and automatic guilt by association. And because of this, the term terrorist is really designed to play upon deep-seated fears and aims to create a knee-jerk reaction, whether or not that evidence is really there. And when you see the media or the state using a terrorist framework, the purpose generally is not to inform, but to mobilize people through fear. And so by keeping the term amorphous, it can be done to silence opposition and intimidate critics. And we need to understand that terrorism as a concept is a fairly recent addition to our political lexicon. Before the 1970s, the term was really very hardly mentioned by politicians. It was discussed in the media, and there were very few anti-terrorism laws or counterterrorism agencies. And when we think about the central role that terrorism plays in our culture nowadays in the post 9/11 world, it really becomes kind of a puzzle how something that was really a minor form of political violence and much really construed as much more of a criminal nuisance than anything else came to play such a prominent place in our politics and our society. And so one of the ways that examining the history of terrorist legislation, things like that, at the UN in the early 70s, there was a discussion on how the United Nations should approach this concept of terrorism, and non-Western states argued that colonial domination and oppression, no matter when it originated, was a clear case of aggression, and that because that principle of self-determination was a fundamental one, um, people had the right, the human right, to exercise self-defense in the struggle for their independence. That would be a lawful act under international law. And in the representative Cameroon said, it would be inconsistent to accord the right of self-determination while refusing the means of exercising that right. So during these debates, you had members of the United Nations arguing that terrorism, what we would now call terrorism, was a protected human right as long as that was done against colonial powers, because that would be what we would now envision as a form of self-defense. Now, of course, this idea was completely rejected by Western states, and and they were saying that yes, self-determination was completely a recognized right, but this was quite a different matter from stating that force used in the exercise of self-determination was used was used in accordance with the purposes of the United Nations. So the Western nations, the Europeans, the United States, argued that yeah, you totally have the right to self-determination, but you shouldn't be allowed to use force to achieve that right. And I bring that up just so we understand that terrorism, there's an old saying, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. And I think those debates really get at that point really well, in that it shows that you would have groups who would argue very strongly that terrorism, as long though we would again what we would now call terrorism, as long as it's done in liberating individuals, is not a bad thing. And again, those in power argue that it would be a bad thing because it would potentially harm those in power. And again, I'm not trying to take a side in this debate, but just show that this is a long and interesting debate that we can have, and understand that I'm really simplifying these debates as a whole and really boiling them down to the bare minimum as well. And so going through and kind of juggling some of the definitions, the FBI definition is a really good one as a good example of federal agency definitions, and that they argue that domestic terrorism, again, we're going to be focusing domestic here, are actions perpetrated by individuals and or groups inspired by or associated with primarily US-based movements that espouse extremist ideologies of a political, religious, social, racial, or environmental nature. Um, on first glance, this definition seems pretty good, but then we need to look at it and kind of break it down a little bit in that um, the phrase that gets me here is extremist. How do we define that? What is how do we define what is extremist essentially? Because you're going to have different groups defining that as differently. So things like that we need to kind of break apart as we go through these definitions. The legal code is a little bit better in that it defines domestic terrorism as activities that involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any individual state, and appears to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. This is a little bit better, but keep this definition in mind, especially when we get to the just war not the political definitions of terrorism. We're going to get to that in a slide or two, and you'll see how things like having a stipulation that has to be a violation of law can be a problem when we're talking about terrorism. And some of the academic definitions of terrorism that are fairly common, and I pulled these all from the Turk article. Crenshaw defined terrorism as the premeditated use or threat of symbolic, low-level violence by conspiratorial organizations. Um, so this was done in 1981. So this was before the large um, cultural terrorist acts that are part of our lives nowadays. So under this definition, something like 9/11 may not be considered terrorism because it would not be a form of low-level violence. Bergeson and Lizardo in 2004 defined it as the use of violence by non-state groups against non-combatants for symbolic purposes, that is, to influence or somehow affect another audience for some political, social, or religious purpose. Um, Better, and we can see how this was defined um, through the terrorist actions of that we saw through the 80s and 90s. But then again, the question becomes of how do we define non-combatants and things like that. And then Gaynor in 98, terrorism is the intentional use of or threat to use violence against civilians or against civilian targets in order to attain political aims. The question I have here is a threat tantamount to an actual terrorist act, or is it just a threat? So it's things like that. And if you don't follow that, let me know on one of the discussion forums, and I can break that down a little bit more. But understand is that how even in law where we have attempted assault and assault are two different crimes. So should there be a delineation here between an attempt to an actual terrorist action, actually committing violence, or threat to violence? Are those both the same level of terrorism? And so things like that, and all of these are questions that we can ask from these definitions. So Hadley kind of breaks down the widespread terrorism definitions that we see and breaks them into two broad categories, political and just war definitions. Um, Hadley breaks down political definitions are ones that are usually backed by government agencies and argue that a condition of terrorism is unlawfulness. Um, the large issue with using lawfulness as a requirement of the definition is that any acts that are not already codified against law do not count as terrorism. Um, and so it's something like that that we really need to stop and consider. Um, how, if something, I can't think of an example, but if somebody does something that is against the law, like, let's say technology wise, and harms a bunch of people like that, would that be considered terrorist acts? So if we look at a couple of decades ago, before stealing an identity was really a thing, and somebody was able to steal the identities of a large group of people, would that be considered a terrorist action because that was not codified against the law yet? Hopefully that makes sense. Um, and the next definition that he really breaks down is called the just war definition. And this is the organized use of violence or threat of violence against non-combatants or their property for political purposes. Um, and this is the problem here we have is how do we define innocence? Is it determined through individual actions? Um, did somebody do something to deserve violent action? either through self-defense or peremptory violence, um, and something like that. So if we're going to use the term innocents or non-combatants, um, soldiers would not be able to be victims of terrorist actions. If we're talking about the militarization of police, police officers would not be able to be victims of terrorist actions because we may or may not be able to define them as non-combatants or innocents. Again, whether or not you agree with that, these are issues that we can talk about when we're kind of delineating these definitions. Um, One of the things that Hadley talks about is that when we are using political purposes as a as a stipulation of terrorism, it can be kind of tricky. So he used the example of a Party A supporter smashing the campaign table of a Party B supporter and violently assaulting that Party B supporter. Um, Assault by nature is a violent act, and because this is done through the lens of two political parties, it would meet the political purposes stipulation. And so this could be defined as a terrorist action. And if it did, there would be no political violence. That would not be terrorism under these definitions, um, under this stipulation. And so if you guys remember the 2016 elections, when Donald Trump came to San Jose, there were fights, large scale fights that were occurring outside the convention centers. I remember this actually made national news. So if we're including these definitions of political violence in terrorism, those fights could be could fall under the definition of terrorism, but I don't think any one of us would consider it a form of terrorism that we as a culture would define. And understand I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with those with what happened. Just using it as an example of some of the issues that we can talk about when we're talking about political violence and matching it up to terrorism. Um, so next, we're going to jump into state terrorism. State terrorism can be broadly defined as threats or acts of violence carried out by representatives of the state against civilians to instill fear for political purposes. And again, we can tear this definition apart as we want. But it's important, I think it's important to sit down and have a brief discussion about state terrorism in that it doesn't quite always match up to um, it isn't always included in our definitions of terrorism and our examples and our cultural conversations on it. So we can talk about historical examples, including things like CIA actions in Cuba, including things like the bombing of hotels, sinking of fishing boats, and the poisoning of livestock and crops. And then, of course, including things like the failed Bay of Pigs invasion and the attempted assassinations against Fidel Castro. We can talk about the carpet bombing of Laos or the Nixon administration's overthrow of the democratically elected government in Chile in September 11th, 1973. And those are some historical examples. And we can also talk about um, a slightly more contemporary example done by the Obama administration with the use of drone bombings in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Libya, um, with the government estimating that between Obama's two terms, the drone strikes killed over 2,500 people, and the administration arguing that all but 116 of those were combatants. So only 116 civilian deaths could be attributed to drone strikes during Obama's two terms. Um, the issue with this, of course, is that drone strikes are not accurate, with some estimates arguing that only 2% of strikes kill high level targets. Um, and then additionally, the Obama administration would use problematic methods to measure whether a person killed in a drone strike was a militant or not. Um, in the administration's policies, an adult male killed in a drone strike is considered a militant unless undeniable proof is offered to the contrary. Um, and this is not to say that the other administrations are not innocent are innocent of state terrorism. There are examples that we can attribute to both Bush administrations, the Clinton administration, and certainly the Trump administration. It's just these are the examples that I tend to pull out. Um, so there are always going to be examples of state terrorism that we can pull out, and then we need to kind of frame them within this larger conversation of terrorism and question why they are not there. So here we're going to shift into a little rapidly. We're going to shift into radical environmental movements. Um, so this includes things like the Earth Liberation Front and the Animal Liberation Front, who are at one time considered the highest domestic terrorism investigative priority for the FBI. Um, so again, if you remember the late 90s or early 2000s, this was a big thing. And I'll be honest with you guys, one of the reasons why I do want to bring these guys up, bring radical environmental groups up, is this is actually my area of research. So this is a little bit of a selfish decision on my part, but I do still believe that this gives us an interesting way to examine what we consider terrorism, what we don't consider terrorism, and why that is. So radical environmental movements in the United States was arguably born with Greenpeace. So Greenpeace still exists, would lobby Congress and various other governmental agencies, while at the same time performing direct action and civil disobedience to protect whales and other wildlife, largely oceanic wildlife. Eventually, disagreements in the organization over how to handle direct action came to a head when the organization adopted a policy avoiding direct action in favor of civil disobedience. So this led to Paul Watson being voted out of the organization in 1977 over his increasingly confrontational tactics while protecting newborn harp seals from hunters. And after leaving Greenpeace, he ended up finding the more radical organization, the Sea Shepherd. With the help of different organizations, they performed protests all over the world, including sinking of multiple boats involved in whaling and even blockading Canadian sealing fleets. Then the next major group that came out would be Earth First. They were largely born out of a decision called the Roadless Area Review Evaluation, which garnered widespread opposition from many in the environmental movement. This decision, what it did was it opened up thousands upon thousands of protected federal land to logging rights. And there are people in the movement who argue that the government was selling out the environment to loggers. And one of these people, the loudest critics, was Dave Foreman, a high level member of the Wilderness Society. He viewed President Carter, and many in that administration as traitors to the environmental movement. And Foreman eventually resigned from the Wilderness Society and moved back to the American Southwest. And there he went on a retreat with other environmentalists in the Picante Desert, where they talked about what they saw as a lack of vision in the mainstream environmental movement, the ineffectiveness of a moderate stance, and the disconnect between white collar leadership and grassroots activists on the ground, as well as the extreme lengths industry and governments would go to go against environmental protections. And what this group decided was that a different tactic was going to be needed to fight against the damage being done to the environment. So they believed that they needed to create a new organization, and they based it actually off of a book. The book was called The Monkey Wrench Gang, and it was about a group of neo-Luddite rebels with an ecological cause who scorned the convoluted tactics of environmentalism and instead took direct action in the form of ecotage, which we'll talk about in a minute, to protect the environment. Um, and so, if anybody that doesn't know, the Luddites were a group of workers in industrial England who, after losing their jobs to machines in the factories, would go in and destroy the machines as a way of forcing the factory owners to give them back their jobs. Um, and so the first act that Earth first engaged in was actually in 1981, where they enrolled a large sheet of black plastic to create the impression of a massive 300-foot rift in the Glen Canyon Dam to protest the destruction of nature in favor of just a huge mass of concrete. From then on, Earth first would engage in a wide variety of direct action, ranging from blockading logging roads to sit-ins in forestry offices and in treetops to prevent loggers from coming in and cutting down those trees. Um, Eventually, they started moving to a more dangerous form of direct action called tree spiking, and they started doing this in 1984. Tree spiking involves the insertion of a long metal spike into trees that are marked for logging. And the point of this is to damage the saws used to fell the tree or to damage the sawmill later on. And Earth First goal with this was to serve as a long-term deterrent, slowing down the logging industry and affecting logging profits. Um, and to give you guys an idea, tree spiking is extremely dangerous. What'll happen is if one of the saws that is used to cut down the tree hits that spike, there is a risk of blowback, where the saw will bite back against the logger and hurt and start cutting into them. For I can't think of a nice way to say it. That being said, what Earth First will tend to do is they will put up signs on trees that have been spiked, and they'll say this tree has been spiked. There is a metal rod in it. Cut at your own risk, something along those lines. Or they'll put the spikes so high up in the tree that the loggers will still be able to cut the tree down, but it will damage the sawmill later on. Um, so, and that being said, again, this is an extremely dangerous tactic to use. And the time I've been doing research on this, I've never been able to find um, an an example of someone being killed by tree spiking, and I could only find one story of somebody being injured by it. That's not to say that the other stories aren't out there or that it has not happened. It's just I have not been able. It's not coming up in my research yet. So those are both things to keep in mind when we're talking about actions like this. Um, The the Animal Liberation Front is the other big radical environmental movement that we can be familiar with. And this group actually was not founded in the United States. We're not exactly sure when the ALF was founded, but what most academics are agreed upon is that the one of the first animal rights groups that we can recognize was actually the Band of Mercy in actually 1824, who was focused on ending what they called the barbarity of traditional fox hunting. And then we can trace them going up to the Hunt Saboteurs Association in 1963 with a similar goal, both of these groups in the United Kingdom. So we can see how animal liberation is it draws its inspiration and its impetus from from English groups. And so as these groups, particularly the Hunt Saboteurs Association, would try to find ways to end fox hunting, they would be assaulted by hunters and they wouldn't get a lot of effort done going through the legal system. So you had people breaking off from the Hunt Saboteurs Association and actually revived the Band of Mercy with a focus on direct action, including property destruction. And so what they did was they started sinking boats and destroying vans and other pieces of equipment that'd be used in fox hunting and animal testing and things like that. And the first major action that we can attribute to a radical animal rights group was in 1973 when a half-finished building that was going to be used in the research and vivisection of animals in the Milton Keys was burned. And this kept going until you had members of the group starting getting arrested for raids on animal testing labs in England. Um, and so after these arrests, they started forming what would then be called the Animal Liberation Front. Um, and this has become an international force with cells in dozens of countries. In the United States, we're not really sure exactly what the first action is. Depends on who you ask. Some people say that the very first ALF action in the United States was in Hawaii in 1977 when two dolphins were released from a research lab. Um, Others say that the first action was when activists disguised themselves in lab coats and rescued cats, dogs, and guinea pigs from a New York University medical center. Or it can be as late as 1982 when activists broke into the Howard University laboratory and rescued 24 cats who were deliberately crippled to conduct research. Um, and no matter what the first action is, the ALF can be divided into two large waves. Um, the first one, whereas the ed group was really focused on rescuing animals from research labs and under other industries. And during this wave, the ALF was able to bring public awareness around animal confinement and torture in the name of research and the institutionalized animal abuse in a variety of industries, and was really able to bring about animal welfare reform, and in some cases, actually shut down certain research laboratories. And then the second wave was really when they shifted away from rescuing animals and started the destruction of the destruction of property that was the destruction of property, sorry, that was used in this research. And one of the examples that we can look at that was when actually in 1987, when Animal Liberation Front activists set fire to a research laboratory at the University of California, Davis, where they caused over $5 million worth of damages. And so the framing of radical environmentalists as terrorists really actually didn't come about to the 90s. Um, and one of the first places that we looked at was Ron Arnold of the Center for the Defense of Free Enterprise, who actually coined the term eco-terrorism actually in 1983, sorry. Um, and he defined ecoterrorism as the deliberate destruction of the artifacts of industrial civilization in the name of environmental protection. Um, and again, the problem with this definition is that this can be boiled down to any crime committed to save nature. Um, and so the first time that this framework really came about was actually in a Washington Post article talking about tree spiking. Um, the thing to understand about Ron Arnold is he his stated goal. This is a quote directly from him: is that his goal was to destroy environmentalism once and for all. He is very much a industrialist. He thinks nature is here for us to be used and things like that. Again, whether or not you agree with that or not, you understand how that ideology affected his framing. But so the public relations campaign that Arnold started um, that introduced the term eco-terrorism into popular lexicon um, once it got mobilized, and I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Yeah, just understand that this framework is problematic at best, especially when we start things like ecotage. Because when Arnold was talking about eco-terrorism, he was most likely talking about this. Um, and ecotage is broadly defined as the extra-legal tactics of radical environmental groups seeking to inflict targeted economic harm upon individuals and firms regarded as causing serious ecological damage. Um, Understand that unlike civil disobedience, where acts are committed in public and protesters will willingly accept punishment for extra legal forms of protest, ecotage is much more typically committed in secret, and individuals responsible for the acts aim to avoid legal consequences, although their groups may claim responsibility in the hopes of influencing public opinion. This reluctance to face the legal consequences is is at least partially explained by Ecotage's primary private audience, as well as the practical concerns arising from property damage. Um, and again, property damage can go from anything from pulling up survey stakes and disabling machinery to things like major vandalism like arson. And because this can have increasing punishments for those who are caught and prosecuted, particularly when we compare it to traditional civil disobedience. Um, and Arnold was really successful in his campaign when the FBI labeled, again, the fire at UC Davis as a terrorist action connected to animal rights. And the fire at UC Davis was the first radical environmental action to be labeled ecoterrorism. Um, and by defining this issue, Arnold was actually able to control the debate by going up before the House Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on Crimes in 1988, particularly their hearing on acts of ecoterrorism committed by radical environmental organizations. And in his testimony, Ron Arnold conflated all forms of environmental action with terrorism, including calling the process by which loggers lost their jobs through environmental lawsuits a form of economic terrorism, despite the fact that legal actions such as these are nonviolent and aim to force the government to enforce its own environmental protection laws. Um, and this focus on environmental terrorism is an example of the capitalist class using their influence to frame activism to their advantage. By applying this frame of terrorism, an act that has historically taken multiple lives over the years, the owning classes are able to create fear around an act that would affect their interests directly. Again, so if we compare 9/11 to the UC Davis fires, the difference here, the main difference is that a lot of people died in 9/11. Nobody died in UC Davis, in the UC Davis fires. And again, I'm not trying to compare these things one on one, just understand that our traditional lexicon and understanding of terrorism, people die. And environmental actions, and even the FBI has agreed to this fact, no one has ever died as a result of a radical environmental action. So this question becomes, why do we call this terrorism? Um, and Dave Foreman, again, the founder of Earth First, set out a list of principled constraints in the book he wrote called The Field Guide to Monkey Wrenching. And in this, he stated that action should never be directed at living things, and that all due care must be taken to ensure that humans and animals not be harmed. He called this the first principle of ecotage, and he actually admonished potential eco activists further to aim their attacks only at inanimate objects and tools that are destroying life, rather than at persons, avoiding mindless, erratic vandalism and focusing upon narrowly targeted objects that are ecologically destructive. And so, again, we can look at the Vale fire, which is the image on the left, and then um, we can. Sorry, we were talking about the Davis fires. The Vale fire was an ELF action in 1998, where, in the name of protecting lynx habitats, Earth Liberation Front activists burned down several buildings at the new ski resort in Vail, Colorado, and they caused $12 million worth of damage. Um, the image on the right is actually from what's arguably one of the most famous actions by um, radical environmentalists down in Los Angeles, um, where they burned 125 sport utility vehicles and Hummers, and they caused a total of $3.5 million worth of damage. And they spray painted "I love pollution" at the scene. So again, at no point am I going to sit here and say that radical environmental actions are not destructive or do not cost a lot of damage in property damage. But does that equal our level of our understanding of terrorism that causes harm against human beings? And like, I'm going to let you guys make that decision, but this is something we need to consider and talk about. Um, and so this really got this framing of radical environmentalism and radical animal rights activism as terrorism was really able to gain a powerful hold on the public mind. Um, and it eventually was able to gain traction with public and state and federal lawmakers. Um, but this was really done through a campaign to tie ecotage to terrorism. Um, and this succeeded through what was called the Animal Enterprise Protection Act, the AEPA, in 1992. And what this does is it created a special offense for any person traveling or using foreign commerce for the purpose of causing physical destruction at an animal enterprise. Um, and this was done through the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. ALEC was founded in the 70s, and it maintains itself as a pro-corporate conservative nonprofit group. Um, and their membership is really made up of both legislatures and industry representatives. And what they do is they introduce model representation to Congress, to members of Congress who can then introduce it to the House and Senate and have it be voted on. Um, so one of the things we need to remember is that during this time period, the chair of ALEC was Kurt Malmgren, a representative of the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. Um, and while Malmgren was chair, animal research sites integral to pharmaceutical interests were the target of almost half of all actions claimed by radical environmental movements from 2000 to 2006. Again, this is the timeline is a little off, but it does make sense, trust me. And this creates an incentive for ALEC to criminalize actions that were harming the profit margins of pharmaceutical industries. Um, and even though ALEC admitted that harming or killing somebody was not characteristic of radical environmental groups, ALEC still tried to claim that these groups were terrorist organizations. Um, and that investigations have shown that these radical organizations operate in a similar fashion to other terrorist groups like Al Qaeda. Um, and so by doing this, ALEC was attempting to create a sense that mainstream and radical activists were part of a terrorist framework. And through the lobbying of groups like ALEC, the Center for Consumer Freedom, the United States Sportsman Alliance, the Animal Enterprise Protection Act was signed into law. Um, and it was eventually replaced by the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And I'm kind of blurring the timeline a little bit on these two acts, but do understand that these acts are very similar to each other. And the AETA the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act is really just an expansion of the AEPA. And what the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act did was it covered secondary and tertiary targets, or any person or entity having a connection to or relationship or business transactions with an animal enterprise. And what this did was it increases penalties and brands alleged perpetrators, even if they are not accused of inciting fear, as terrorists. Again, remember when we were talking about the definitions of terrorism earlier, fear was a inciting fear was a main component of it. And according to the Act, animal enterprise is very broadly defined, includes a wide range of entities, from pet stores to corporate farms. And it criminalized any act that caused economic damage to these enterprises as terrorism. Um, and so what this really does is this does include a savings clause, excluding economic disruption from legal activities. So that's how this law does not violate the Constitution. So as long as you behave legally, in quotes legally, you are not guilty of terrorism. Um, and the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act presents a boycott as the only given example of a lawful economic disruption. Um, and so it is within the realm for the possibility of an activist to be arrested under the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act for picketing outside of a KFC. That could potentially be seen um, as a terrorist action under this law if that if you're picketing somehow illegally, if you're trespassing or anything like that. Um, there have been different challenges to the AEPA and the AETA over the years. The first was the Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, or the SHAC-7, 6 of whom are pictured here. Um, SHAC's goal was to close down Huntington Life Sciences, which was Europe's largest animal testing laboratory. Um, so what SHAC did is they targeted anybody with economic ties to Huntington Life Sciences, pressuring them to cut ties to the company, along with holding residual protests at the executives of these companies. Residential protests, sorry. Um, while Shacks did express support for legal and illegal forms of protest, they explicitly expressed support for protest tactics that did not harm anyone. Um, and the way that they really did this was through doxing, the process of taking what would traditionally be private information and publishing it on the internet. Um, and in 2004, 6 SHAC activists were indicted on terrorism charges under the AEPA, despite the fact they were not charged with any illegal crimes. The charges against the activists were all forms of protected speech, including things like publishing a website, advocating protest activity, organizing protests, and contacting companies. But all the activists were eventually charged and convicted under the AEPA, and convicted and sentenced to 4 to 6 years each. The activists eventually challenged their convictions and went up to the Third Court of Appeals, where the court acknowledged that much of their speech was protected, but the presence of unlawful activity by anonymous actors and the activists' support for unlawful protest was enough to constitute a criminal conspiracy. So again, the SHAC-7 did not do anything that was found illegal, did not do anything that harmed anyone, but just because they publicly supported unlawful protests, they are branded as terrorists under the AEPA. Um, they eventually did continue their appeals all the way up to the Supreme Court, but the court did deny their certiorari. The next challenge to the AETA now was in 2011, where 5 animal rights activists argued the AETA, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, unconstitutionally restricted their ability to engage in protest. And they argued that the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act is both uncommonly broad, criminalizes protected speech, and chill future protests. They also argued that it is unconstitutional because it is vague and discriminates on the basis of content of expressive speech. Um, then in 2013, the courts dismissed the suit on the grounds that the plaintiffs did not have standing. What that means is that they were not harmed by the law, so they could not complain about it in the court system, essentially. And they brought it up through the different appellate courts, and then again, the Supreme Court denied their certiorari. Um, And then the last challenge came out for the United States versus Johnson in 2014. Two activists, Johnson and Lang, were convicted under the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act for allegedly releasing thousands of mink and foxes from a fur farm, and conspiracy to release more, and for spray painting "Liberation is Love" on a barn. Johnson and Lang challenged their conviction, arguing that the AETA was unconstitutional. The district court found the law constitutional in 2015, and in 2017, the appeals court upheld that decision. Um, and I bring up these cases because, in the case of the Shack 7 and Johnson and Lang, none of these people did any, harmed anybody. Johnson and Lang released mink and foxes, and the Shack 7 doxed people and said that they supported illegal protest. Whether or not you agree with these actions, you think that they're helping to save the planet or not, I don't know that we can consider them terrorists, even under the definitions that we talked about earlier in the lecture. So just understand that as we're having these conversations, we need to think about what they mean, what these terms mean. And my goal here is not to convince you guys in one direction or the other. Um, if you think that these laws are perfectly constitutional and the Johnson and Lang are terrorists, okay, that I'm not trying to convince you otherwise. I'm just trying to get you to think about it. So, with that being said, that is the end of today's lecture. So if you have any questions, make sure to email me. As a reminder, your guys' exam is this coming week, is up this week, so there's no discussion or quiz to be uploaded. So good luck on the exam, and if you have any questions, please make sure to email me. Otherwise, have a good week and good luck. And then the next group that really came out of the radical environmental movement was the Earth Liberation Front, the ELF, ELF. And the ELF actually was born out of a Earth First protest at the Warner Creek site in Oregon. Um, After a fire that occurred at the National Forest, the government decided to open the area up to logging for the first time. This was previously a protected area. Um, After losing a court injunction in 1995 to protect the forest, a group of Earth First activists decided to form a blockade at the only road going into the site. So what they did is they built a giant wall emblazoned with the name Earth First, complete with drawbridge and tents for them to live in. And they decided to live there to stop people from coming in and being able to cut down the trees. And they were able to do that for well over a year until federal law enforcement officers and the Forestry Service came in and destroyed the blockade and arresting protesters. Activists who were bitter over what happened responded by setting fire to two ranger stations in retaliation for the events. Nobody was actually hurt at either fire, but this was largely seen as the first ELF action in the United States. And this really caused a split in the environmental movement, where you had younger activists cheering on the arsons, while others viewed the democratic public protest as a proper channel to go through to effect change. Um, and the next major event that played a role in the creation of ELF was in Eugene, Oregon, where activists squared off against police while protecting a group of heritage trees from being cut down for a parking lot. Um, Activists began to mobilize to protest at the city council meeting in an effort to change the city council's decision and protect those trees. So they were making an effort to go through the more legal means to affect change. Instead, the city council announced that they were going to move up the uh, the the cutting down of the heritage trees one day before the city council meeting, making it so that the activists could not protest there and could not try to affect change. Um, So what the activists did is they went and engaged in tree sitting. That's exactly what it sounds like, where they climbed up the trees and decided, hey, we're going to sit up here for as long as it takes. Um, the goal is just to hold off the cutting of the trees for one day until the city council meeting so they could actually go there and protest in democratic methods. Um, the city met with unfortunately some pretty oppressive techniques, where police responded to the tree sitting in riot gear and used tear gas and used a cherry picker to reach the protesters in the trees, where they actually used and I wish I was joking, cut open protesters' pants and used pepper spray on their genitalia. Um, and this really convinced a lot of activists in the ELF that working within the system was no longer an option. So they started relying on more on different tactics and different techniques outside of the rule of law and civil protest as a way to affect change.